Do you get frustrated trying to keep assorted fasteners organized, or aggravated just trying to carry them from one project to the next? Yeah, me too. So, thanks for clicking on this video to check out Next Level Carpentry. I hope it means you're interested in making super handy portable organizers like these, because I'm going to show you how, step by step. I call these handy portable organizers Porta-Ganizers, and they're made from square vinyl fence post scrap and common hardware items. I'll show you how to make 3 totes in this video. This one with 5 compartments and this one with 3 compartments are both made with 4-inch square vinyl fence post pieces. This 3-compartment model is made with 5-inch fence post scraps for more storage capacity. And all 3 of these organizers are 8 inches tall, which I've found to be a handy depth in general. I use these 2 4-inch totes to carry a full range of torque-starved construction fasteners to and from the job site. That way I have all the lengths that I need available anytime and anywhere I choose to take them. But hey, that's just me. Using the steps I'm going to show you in this video, you can make these for storing all sorts of things just by varying the numbers and the sizes of compartments. You can choose whatever compartment size and count it takes to keep your stuff organized and make it portable. From maximum to minimum, it's all up to you. I want to give a special shout out to Mark L., an attentive viewer who, after seeing a previous video I did for making these organizers, sent me an entire pallet of post pieces from his fence installation business just to see what other ideas I might come up with. So thank you, Mark. This video, in a large part, is possible because of your generosity, and I appreciate it. At the end of this video, I'll give you some ideas and some links for places that you can get fence post scraps, and the common and not so common hardware items that you would need if you choose to build some Porta-Ganizers of your own. So stay tuned for that. Also, check for links in the video description for build kit options and the specialty adhesive that I'll use for holding these kits together. The options linked in the video description are subject to change without notice, so check back from time to time for special pricing, products, and packages. Now, once you've decided on compartment size, count, and quantity, it's time to start making. So let's make. Start by cutting pieces for all the compartments to length. They're easy to cut on a miter saw with a carbide tipped blade, and more teeth are better. Trim the ends square first, and then set up a stop so that you get a consistent length on all your compartment pieces. Let the saw spool up to full speed and make cuts with a smooth, consistent cutting motion for best results. Some vinyl is more brittle than others, and it can chip or break if you cut with the blade going too slow or make the cut itself too fast. Use a deburring tool, like this one made by General, to clean up the outer edges of these pieces to make for a nicer fit and finish later. Don't worry about the inner edges for now. They get deburred later on in the build. With a sharp deburring tool, a light touch is all that's needed to clean off the sharp edge left by the saw cut. For each organizer top and bottom, just clamp the compartment pieces together and then cut off a section of fence post 1.5 inches longer than their combined length. To get that length, I just burn 1.5 inches on one end of the tape and read the other end. For these, I come up with a measurement of 21 5/8, so I'm just going to call it 21 3/4. And it just so happens another scrap piece I have is almost the perfect length, so I just have to trim a little off one end. And remember to let the saw spool up when making these trimming cuts so that the small pieces come off cleanly. For now, rip these approximately in half and set aside for later. I make these cuts using a thin kerf rip blade backed up by a saw blade stabilizer for a nice smooth cut. I also use a zero clearance throat insert plate set up for a thin kerf blade, and then set the blade height to just about 1/4 inch and cut these pieces in half in 2 passes. Keep in mind that there's tension in the square vinyl tube, so there's a tendency for the tube to pinch the blade right at the end of the first rip cut. I wear Smurf gloves and hang onto the piece securely, and the cuts are no problem. And I'll trim these top and bottom pieces to the right size later on in the build. And that's because, as with wood, you can cut vinyl off, but you can't cut it on. As long as you're in measuring and cutting mode, cut a couple of scraps of straight wood for each organizer, about the same length as the pieces we cut for the tops. Anything will do as long as it's stiff and nice and straight. Clean all the compartment pieces with a decent solvent like lacquer thinner prior to glue up. The solvent cleanup removes any scuff marks that are on your scrap pieces and also assures that the surfaces are free of silicone, oil, or grease that would prevent the adhesive from bonding. Once you have all the compartment pieces for one organizer all cleaned up, put them between those two scrap blocks of wood, which will help with alignment during the glue up. I like to put mine up against the rip fence on the table saw, so I've got something to push against to keep things lined up. You'll need 3 clamps for each organizer, 1 for the length and 2 for the height. I prefer squeeze clamps like this because they simplify the process, but other types of clamps will work. We'll be using vinyl adhesive for assembly. It's some pretty nasty stuff, so make sure to wear those protective gloves, boys and girls, and have plenty of ventilation. Read the instructions on the vinyl adhesive carefully for cautions and cure times for the product you're using. FYI, vinyl adhesive is different stuff than the typical PVC cement, which doesn't bond this type of plastic, even though it looks the same. Trim the tip of the adhesive tube at an angle like this, and then put a generous bead of vinyl adhesive between each compartment and press them all next to each other along a wood scrap. Make sure to keep a roll of paper towels and a garbage can handy, because this stuff spreads like oobleck, and once it gets on something, it gets on everything. Once you have adhesive between all the adjoining compartments, use the short clamps on the wood blocks to align all the ends of the compartments. And finally, take that long clamp and put a little pressure to keep the compartments snug together as the glue cures. Tapping everything firmly down to the bench top like this assures alignment of the faces, and good clamp pressure on the blocks assures alignment of the ends. If by any chance you got discrepancy in the length of the tubes, use shims to make sure that at least one end of all the compartments is lined up. Because I use the length stop, none of this shimming is necessary. This next step adds a next level touch to the project. And this is why I had you trim the tip on the adhesive tube at an angle. Using the angled tip like a caulk tube, lay a full generous bead of adhesive between each compartment on each side of the assembly. Start and stop about 3/4 of an inch in from each end of the compartment pieces, because these ends get trimmed off later. You'll have to switch the long compression clamp during this step so that you can get a nice even bead of adhesive on the seams between the compartments. Clean up any excess quickly while the glue is still wet for a neater overall finish. I got a little spooging on that one, but I'll just get it cleaned up quickly and pretend nobody noticed. That just shows it's a good idea to clean off the tube tip and be careful with how much you squeeze the tube while applying this bead of adhesive. And there, after the 10th seam, it looks like I'm finally getting the hang of this. And then just make sure to put that clamp back in place while the glue finishes curing. Once you get to this stage, it's time to take either a hike or a nap to wait while the glue cures. Instructions on this adhesive say to allow it to set for 5 minutes and remain undisturbed for 30. I don't know about you, but 5 minutes is easy, but I may become disturbed by the time 30 minutes is up. Of course, cure times vary with temperature and humidity, but I'll speed things up dramatically by putting this assembly out in the hot summer sun for a while, where I think a good hour's cure time will be plenty to proceed with the build. This is as bad a time as any to talk about channel business. So I'll make it quick, even though we can't do anything else right now while that glue is curing. I want to ask you to subscribe to Next Level Carpentry if you haven't already. I'm excited because the channel recently passed the 200,000 subscriber milestone, and with your help, it's possible to hit an even 250K by the end of the year. And that would be a great way to wrap up 2020, don't you think? You'll find links in the video description to Amazon for tools and supplies, to Starbond for 15% off CA glue, to PayPal and Patreon to support this channel, and to Teespring for Next Level Carpentry swag. And I want to say thanks for checking those out, because I appreciate any and all support. Wow, that didn't take too long. And the glue dried quickly too. Imagine that. In reality, I let these assemblies cure overnight to make sure the adhesive is completely set up. And you can see how strong these assemblies are once I get the clamps off. And this whole thing is fused together like a solid piece. So they're really strong for the organizers. You can see on this assembly, I had to revert to a regular screw type clamp. And I want to point this out, that the best way to orient the clamps is so that they're sticking off the end of the assemblies. That way this clamp fits on here nice and snug. If these clamps are oriented this way, it prevents the compression clamp from fitting on there well. So that's a little best practices thing that I learned during this particular build. With the glue up all complete, the next step is to notch these assemblies so that the top and bottom channels fit snugly. Still using the same thin kerf rip blade and blade stabilizer, I set the blade depth to just over the wall thickness of the square tubing I'm using. There's a lot of variance in wall thickness from one manufacturer to the next, so set your blade depth accordingly. Here I'm leaving the teeth a good 1/16 of an inch proud of the wall thickness of this material. Now set your rib fence to 1 1/4 inches to the far side of the blade. I use a rule to make this setting because the saw's cursor on the rib fence doesn't measure to this directly. My thin kerf blade is 3/32 of an inch thick, so the setting on the cursor actually shows 3/32 less than 1 1/4 inches. The difference being the kerf thickness of the blade you're using. Make a cut with this setting along the top and bottom of both faces of all the organizers you're building as the relief cuts for the lid notches. Notch a couple pieces of scrap while you're at it, so you can use the scrap pieces for setting up the next couple cuts to complete these notches, so that you don't risk making a mistake on one of your glued up assemblies and ruining them. Now raise the blade height to about 1/16 of an inch shy of the relief cuts we just made. This is important to keep cut off pieces from flying around when the next cuts are made. And I'll use one of my scrap sample pieces to make this blade height setting. Add a large sacrificial push fence to a miter gauge for this next step, where we'll cut out the compartment faces. These are rough cuts, so they don't have to be precise. All you need to do is miss the vertical compartment dividers, but pay close attention so you're not hit by flying pieces if they break loose while cutting. And if you're uncertain how it's going to work, wearing a face shield during this step just might be a good idea. I try to get within about 1/8 of an inch of those vertical dividers, but anything that's left will just get trimmed off in the next step. If you've got a good zero clearance insert on your table saw, making these cuts very close to the dividers without hitting them is really simple. Just look down inside the compartments and slide the compartment over till it's next to the blade cut slot and then make the cut. And you can make a very close cut perfectly every time. And when using this sort of setup, always be mindful of the saw blade exiting behind your sacrificial push fence. Once you've made all the rough cuts, you can just bend these little tabs to break them free, or if that's too tough, just use a utility knife to finish the cuts and release the pieces. Either way, this keeps these little pieces from turning into ninja stars if you try to cut them off completely using the table saw. This next operation is kind of a tricky one because the wall thickness of the square vinyl tubing tends to vary quite a bit between tubing style, tubing manufacturer, and it even varies somewhat in a batch of tubing of the same type from the same source. The goal is to make cuts on these compartment dividers so that the lids and the bottom fit smoothly, flush, and snug to the compartments. You can see the cuts here on this finished organizer. It's just a small notch here, and the lid fits snug and flush on the organizer. The tricky part is if these cuts are made too shallow, the lid's hard to get on and it doesn't fit flush. But if the cuts are made too deep, then the lid won't fit snugly in place and just falls off in use. Because the wall thickness of tubing from some suppliers tapers out of the corners, you might need to set your blade at a 1 or 2 degree angle for a good fit in your situation. So it's a good idea to practice on those scrap pieces of tube to get the fence and blade settings right, and then go ahead and cut along the top and bottom faces of all your organizers. And I leave these cuts proud for now because I can always trim off a little bit more later to dial in the fit of the lid. To start the notching process, raise the saw blade up so it's just shy of the relief cuts made earlier. And then add a sacrificial piece to your rib fence so that the blade doesn't score the metal surface. And then set the fence so it trims away a little less than the wall thickness of the tube you're working with. Next, use a grinder, file, or sanding block to round off the top corners of the compartment dividers so that the radius fits inside the lid. This part is more art than science, so approach with caution here too. I'll do an initial fit of the lid at this stage just to see how things are coming along. So far, I like what I see, so I'll proceed with these steps on the glued up assemblies before trimming the lids for height to fit later. And you'll have to take my word for it, but believe me, this step is a whole lot less dramatic than if you're trying to cut the whole sidewall out at the same time with this step. So the extra steps involved in cutting out those tabs from the sides were well worth it. And you can see how the sides of this lid are kind of pooching out along the sides of the organizer. And when you look on the inside and the end, you can see that a little bit of a taper on these cuts would help the fit considerably. So once I make all these initial cuts and pre-grind the corners, I'll make a change to the table saw setup to add that slight angle. Because my table saw is a right tilt, I had to switch the fence around. If yours is left tilt, this will look the opposite. But I just used one of my scrap pieces here. I've got the blade tilted at 2 degrees, and I set that blade to just take a shaving off these two shoulders. And with that almost imperceptible cut, this fits just like I want it. The taper fits on the inside here, and this is nice and flush on the outside. And this is the art part of it, so I'll do this on a longer section to see if everything still jives up. This small tube flex is different than this assembly. But the goal here is to sneak up on it, because if once you get it too loose, you're kind of done. So I'm actually going to back the fence off a little bit from my setting on that, because it barely takes a cut at all to get this accomplished. And that's still looking really good. So I'll proceed by putting that 2-degree bevel on all of these compartments, and then go through a few more steps to tune up the lids for an optimal fit. Those are all the steps I use for trimming this, and you just need to repeat those until you get a fit that you're happy with. These are coming out pretty nice. I'm actually doing a 5-inch wide container here. It's working pretty well too. It's still a little bit proud in a couple places, but that can be trimmed off a little bit later. But now is the step where I trim the legs of the lids down to get a nice tight fit inside the container. And again, I'll sneak up on that cut so that they fit nice and snug. And it's most important to have it fit on the outside edge here, almost more so than on the inside there. Measuring from the inside of the lid like this down to the relief cut accounts for the thickness of the lid itself. And using that measurement, I come up with 1 3/8 inches. So I'm going to start off on the table saw with a full 1 7/16 inches for my initial cut, see how it fits, and trim more if necessary. Remember to remove that 2-degree bevel setting you were just using for trimming the container assemblies, and then lower the blade height so it's just a little bit more than the thickness of this tube. Then set the fence and rip off both legs to that strong measurement we made a second ago. I'm getting a nice snug fit with this lid that I'm really happy with, but it looks like the legs are still about 1/16 of an inch long, so I'm going to shave them one more time for a final fit. And that right there is the perfect fit that I'm after. I've learned to approach these steps with caution because I've gotten to this stage before and the lids just fall off or they're the wrong length. So if you follow the steps the way I've laid them out so far in the video, approach with caution, sneak up on your measurements, you can get this kind of fit, and it won't be by accident. And the good news is, this is the worst these lids are going to fit. When we're done trimming them, they'll fit even better. Now it's time to trim the bottoms for their final fit. To get an accurate length mark on the bottom, I simply flush the bottom piece up with one end of the organizer compartments and mark the other end with a fine point Sharpie. Use extra caution when trimming these bottoms on the miter saw because thin cuts that are unsupported can literally explode during the cut. So I use an auxiliary fence to support the channel and then cut it with the legs against the fence, making sure to let the saw spool up to full RPM and then making the cut slowly, smoothly, and steadily. Once the bottom is cut to length and I like the fit, I use a deburring tool to make a lap around all the edges, inside and out, to clean them up because it gives a better fit and finish after glue up. after cleaning up the bottom lid. I spent a few minutes with a file, a grinder, the deburring tool, whatever it takes to clean up the bottom ends of all the compartment divider pieces for a nicer, cleaner final fit. There's fuzz from the grinder and little tabs here and there from the cutting process, and it makes a real nice fit and finish to just clean these up before this gets glued on a little later. Make sure to deburr the outside faces of all the compartments because this makes for a better glue up when the bottom's put on. A smaller, smoother file works exceptionally well for cleaning up the fuzz left by the grinder. And I'm intentionally leaving these little flared edges on the bottom ends because they make for a better bonding surface when the bottom gets glued on. This side of the bottom fits nicely with the sides of the organizer, but when I flip it over, you can see it's not quite flush. So I'll do a little more prep work on the dividers on this side so that it ends up flush for glue up. And a few passes with this heavy cutting, long, flat file make quick work of the task. When cleaning up the tops of the compartments, I start by filing off the sharp little flaring corners that were left behind during the earlier notching process. I find that clamping the whole business down to a work surface makes this tedious filing process go quicker and easier. A systematic approach of filing first and then going around with the deburring tool can really streamline this boring process. Turns out I'm not any more fond of filing plastic than I am of sanding wood, so I'm glad to get this over with. And after a little bit of deburring following the filing, I'm going to call this good. It takes a few minutes to get all the edges and surfaces cleaned up and smooth, but the result is worth it because the lid fits smoothly while still fitting snug. You can see now that the extra length of the top makes it extend past the end of the organizer, and it serves as a handy handle for lifting off the lid. For a nicer look, I'll trim off the corners at a 22.5-degree angle and give the same cautions for careful cutting on these thin edges so that the saw blade doesn't catch and destroy the piece. You could hear the saw blade trying to catch those edges right there at the end, but with a slow feed rate and plenty of speed, it worked out this time. Notice that I don't cut this angle to a sharp point, but rather stop a little bit short of the inside of the lid so that the finished lid actually has a square end. After trimming the ends on the miter saw, I'll use the grinder to round off the sharp corners where the ends meet the bottoms. And then, like with all the rest of the pieces, I'll make a lap around with that deburring tool to clean up the sharp edges left behind by the saw cuts. And then I use that fine file to touch up any of the little corners that I can't get easily with the deburring tool, so that it has a smooth feel and finish all around. Once all the fitting, filing, and fussing is taken care of, it's time for the messiest step of the build, and that is to glue the bottom onto the compartments. To minimize the mess and mayhem just a little bit, I use frog tape to mask off the areas along the seams between the compartments and the bottom. I leave about 1/16 of an inch on either side of the seam for a good glue spread and really feel that this extra step is worthwhile. But if you don't mind smearing of glue along the outside of your organizers, you can just skip this step. I trim the tape on the ends and put a couple pieces of masking tape there too to keep the migrating mess at a minimum. One more meaningful mess management measure is to mark inside the compartments where beads of adhesive will be put on the inside of the bottom lid. I use a SharpWriter pencil with the lid extended to reach down and mark each side of each compartment on the inside of the bottom lid. And I hope you can see what I'm doing here because this really does help guide where the beads of adhesive should go. And I kind of go into hazmat mode for this glue up because it's smelly and messy. Got protective gloves, I got a piece of cardboard down here to contain the mess. And if you have the luxury, it's great to have two different size tips for your adhesive. I've got this one from gluing the compartments together, and I'll cut another one to about half the size, and that'll help glue along the edges of that bottom. Don't forget to have paper towels handy. You pull this thing apart, and now you can see those marks inside where the dividers are going to sit. Using the larger tip, apply a generous bead of adhesive between each of the pairs of pencil marks on the inside of the bottom of the lid, and then switch to the smaller tip to apply adhesive to the inside of each of the ends. And then, finally, use that small tip to lay a small bead along both edges of the bottom piece. Work quickly because this adhesive skins over and would become ineffective in fairly short order. Once all the beads of glue are applied, slide the compartment assembly down into the bottom channel and quickly make sure the ends are aligned. You've done a good job if you got glue kind of spooging out everywhere, because that way you know there's plenty of adhesive in there. I'll take a paper towel and wipe off the excess on the sides And this is where that tape really helps out, because it keeps that smeared glue confined to that little strip in between the tape. I should have warned you about this part, but I'll use that same clamping block to pinch this together while this glue cures and sets. You heard that popping sound, and that tells me that it is possible to apply too much clamping pressure. But good firm pressure is going to get the job done and hold everything secure. Actually, I'm going to switch the clamps into this position for a little more consistent pressure across the whole organizer. And I'll give you a reminder, this is some stinky stuff with a lot of nasty vapors coming off there. So make sure you have good cross ventilation in the space you're working. And you need that even more because I'm using a little bit of acetone to kind of smooth these joints. This is kind of like tooling a caulk joint with a wet finger. But water doesn't work for this stuff. So I'll use a little bit of acetone to kind of clean up those glue beads while I can. And you can imagine the mess I'd be dealing with right now if that frog tape wasn't on there. And I'd consider that a successful glue up sequence for getting the bottom glued on to the compartments. So now I can just let this cure in the sun for a little while before going through the final steps for putting a handle on here. After a couple hours setup time, I can remove the clamps, then remove the tape. And I really like the way a couple of strips of tape confine the mess from the glue up for a nice clean fit and finish. And using a 1/4-inch roundover bit in my little Bosch Colt router, put the finishing touch on these compartment assemblies by rounding off the corners of this bottom lid for a nice smooth finish. And then a couple quick licks with that file, remove the final sharp edges. Cleaning up those corners of the bottom tray with a router and a file wraps up the organizer build part of this video. And now I'll turn this organizer into a Porta-Ganizer by adding a carry handle to it. To make the carry handle, you'll need 4 pop rivets, 3/16 diameter by a 1/4-inch grip range, plus 8 fender washers, 5/32 by 7/8 in diameter, 2 pieces of 3/4-inch plastic PVC pipe, and 2 strips of 1-inch wide nylon webbing, 20 inches long, and a partridge in a pear tree. If you're cutting fresh strips of nylon strapping like I am, use a mini torch to melt the ends so that they don't fray after being riveted to your Porta-Ganizer. After folding about 1 inch of the strap back, tap the crease with a hammer and then punch the hole through with a 3/16-inch gasket punch. A nice clean hole like that makes it easy to slip the rivet through when pop riveting it to the side of the Porta-Ganizer. The short pieces of pipe make the handles more comfortable to carry when the organizer is fully loaded. To make the short pieces of pipe, I just cut a couple lengths of this stuff at 4 inches long, and then I use the deburring tool to fully radius the inside of the tube so that it doesn't fray the nylon strapping, and a quick pass on a bench grinder takes the burr off the outside of the tube. And I've already washed the printing off the outside of this tube using some acetone, so that's why you don't see red writing on the outside of this pipe like you normally do when you buy the stuff. And then I can just feed the nylon strap through the handle before riveting it to the Porta-Ganizer. Lay out holes for the pop rivets that hold the handles on at 1.5 inches down from the top lip of the storage compartments and 1 inch in from the edge of 2 of them so that the holes are spaced 10 inches apart. And then drill through those marks with a 3/16 drill bit. Naturally, repeat the process on both sides. To install these handles, slip the pop rivet through the washer, through the strap, and then through the side of the storage compartment to hold the handle in place. And then you can use a manual pop riveter like this Click Fast model that I've had for 45 years to install the rivet. Or if you're lucky enough to have a pneumatic pop rivet gun from a big project you did way back in 2006, go ahead and use that for popping the rivets that hold the handles on. Either way, remember to use that second washer on the inside of the compartment for better holding power on these pop rivets. Be careful not to put an extra twist in that strap before you pop rivet it on, so the handles hang and carry nicely. It helps to set the strap at a little bit of an angle when popping the rivets because it's difficult to rotate them after that rivet is drawn tight. And you can see on the inside of the compartments how that second washer is held on by the rivet and makes the handle stronger for when these compartments are all filled with fasteners. Because if a strap comes loose while you're carrying it, all your organization is out the window in a heartbeat. Another accident prevention measure to avoid cascading contents if the lid pops off when the compartments are full of fasteners is to add a simple safety strap like this to secure your stuff. For each safety strap, you'll need a webbing clip like this, plus another 16 inches of strapping and 2 more washers with pop rivets. Cut the 16-inch strap in half to get 2 8-inch pieces, and then use that micro torch to melt the ends. After melting the ends, crease and punch one end of each of these pieces the same way we did with the carry handles earlier. And here's a little pro tip. After folding the 1-inch tab over and tapping with a hammer, add a little heat from the micro torch and then tap it again to set the crease. This helps hold that little tab in place, and that little extra step makes the punching and pop riveting part a little simpler. Next, thread the loose end of each of these straps through the corresponding end of the webbing clip. Next, lay out a mark 1.5 inches down on the center of a compartment near the center of the container. This works better for odd-numbered compartments than it does for even-numbered compartments. And then, like before, drill those marks with a 3/16 inch drill bit. And then follow up by pop riveting the straps to the compartments, remembering to use a washer on both the outside and the inside. If you happen to make an embarrassing mistake like I did and use a pop rivet that's too short, all you need to know is this pro tip. To remove any pop rivet, just re-drill through the center of the pop rivet until it releases. Push any remaining rivet out of the hole, and then just re-rivet with the right length, type, or size. Boom! With those few steps, using a few extra pieces of hardware, you've got a lid that's locked and secure, so that you don't have to worry about the lid popping off and your fasteners spilling all over the place in the shop, on the job, or in your truck. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I want to give you some ideas for finding fence posts and hardware for making Porta-Ganizers. But first, I want to give a shout out to all the patrons who help support this channel by making a pledge through Patreon. Everyone on this list has gone above and beyond to help making videos like this possible. As a token of my appreciation, patrons have access to a growing library of patron-only videos with in-depth stuff like the recent Master Your Joiner series that I did, along with videos where I go deep into the weeds, showing advanced methods and techniques for woodwork and millwork that I use here in the shop and often for projects on my day job. I welcome any who are motivated to join up through Patreon to have access to that exclusive patron-only video library and to see your name on a scrolling list like this somewhere in each Next Level Carpentry video. And now I'll tell you that the best source for inexpensive vinyl posts and vinyl post scraps is a local vinyl fence installer. It'll come as no surprise that the biggest advantage for using a local source for things like fence posts is that you avoid packing and shipping costs, which for long stuff like fence posts can get pretty steep. If you're lucky, a local fencing contractor might sell you full-length fence posts, or better yet, let you dig in their dumpster to either take or to buy at a deep discount. All the vinyl post pieces that I used in this video was scrap that would have ended up in a landfill without Mark's intervention and generosity, which was pretty sweet. All the nylon webbing, clips, rivets, and washers are pretty standard items and available at any worthwhile local hardware store. The one exception is this white vinyl adhesive, which is a specialized item and might be hard to find. As an alternative, I'm working with a large nationwide vinyl fence supplier to come up with a few organizer build kits that could save you the hassle of driving all over town trying to find and buy all the pieces parts needed to build these organizers. And of course, I have no idea what kind of response to expect from viewers who might want to buy kits or what to include in the kits, so pricing and kit contents are going to be subject to change without notice. So it's a good idea to check for links in the video description from time to time to see what's currently being offered if the convenience of a kit is worth the added inevitable expense of packing and shipping those kits. I can tell you that the high quality vinyl adhesive I used in the video for building these organizers is an exception because it's a specialty item. So I have a special link in the video description with a coupon code to use if you want to get the same stuff that I used and recommend. I'll wrap up hoping that this video helps you get better organized, and by saying, as always, thanks for watching. Once you get to this stage, it's time to take a hike or a nap while the glue cures. Once you get to this stage, it's time to take a hike or a nap to wait while the queue. Once you get to this stage, it's time to take a hike or a nap while this queue. Once you get to this stage, it's time to take a hike or a nap. Once you get to this stage, it's time to take a hike or a nap while the queue. Once you get to this stage, it's time to take a hike or a nap. Wow. Somewhere in the world, there's a serene seaside village named Porta-Ganizer. Folks there will either be elated or anguished that I adopted the name of their fair city for these hardware haulers. I imagine this small seaside setting as the site of several shipwrecks over the centuries and submit apologies to survivors subject to the silly association that these plastic products shamelessly promoted here at Next Level Carpentry. I hope the government of the small village doesn't choose to press charges and force me to rename my hardware haulers to be something less offensive to their heritage.